second best-selling system of all time.
Yep.
So the majority, so this is the most interesting generation in terms of the console wars, because the majority of it was literally Sony and Microsoft kind of going back and forth, Sony having a very slow start, Microsoft taking the quick lead, and then Nintendo just flying ahead.
Coming in.
The thing is, though, Nintendo got this massive lead, and then they kind of just stuttered and really didn't continue on towards the second half of the generation.
Yeah.
But they were so far ahead that, like, literally they were gonna win.
They had it in the bag.
Pretty much. Because eventually, because Sony and Microsoft fought tooth and nail at this point, and this was like one of this was like the first real, like, I want to call it like the schoolyard console war.
Yeah.
Where like you got so many like fanboys on one side or the other, when in reality both systems were perfectly fine, and like there was no.
How expensive was the Wii?
I forget. I think. Hey guys, I'm Bill, also known as the Barbecue Games on Instagram.
And I'm Alex, his sister, who brings only chaos.
And together we are the Gaming and Collecting Podcast, a mostly video game centered podcast.
But half the time, we just talk about anime.
And that collecting thing, well, that's mostly just an implication at best.
So come along and enjoy us on this adventure
as we discuss the games that shaped us. So, how you been?
Where am I? What is this place? Who are you? Who are you?
Yeah. So it's been a good couple of weeks since we last recorded.
No, it's only been like 2 weeks. We just didn't record last week, but we're recording.
It's been a while. It's been really hot, really busy.
Oh my god, it's been so hot at work. We've been like, well, I've been melting. His part of the building has AC, but my office, the AC shit the bed, so we've been dying.
Yeah, you gotta remember, I have to leave the room frequently to do things, and it's very hot out there. And even then, when we're working, it's still hot, regardless of the AC.
At least you have it.
Kinda.
Well, it's been hot. Everyone's complaining about it, but we've gotten stuff done. Like, I've been packing a bunch of stuff in the apartment, you know? So, it's weird because every week it just looks more empty and empty. So, it's been weird.
It's alright, my room at home is nothing but boxes now and empty shelves.
Yep. That'll be here soon.
Yep, we're getting close. But other than that, it's been a bit of a couple of weeks. We're mostly just hanging out.
Yeah, hanging out, getting stuff done. Nothing real special. I might be going on a business trip soon, but
yeah.
I just want to move. Like, I'm at that point where I'm just like, I want to move so badly. Like, we did laundry today, and it was like so hot. And we have to walk outside to do laundry in a different building, and it's just stinks. I want to move. Yeah,
it happens. But I guess I can give a couple collecting updates because I actually have bought a few games in the past few weeks. So yeah, I recently picked up mostly Switch games because that's like the only thing I can really collect for.
It's the Switch, bitch.
Yeah, and I don't know if we talked about these previously, so I'll go back as far as I don't think we talked about.
Yep.
A while back I picked up Ni no Kuni 1 and 2 for the Switch.
Nice.
Along with Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 1 and 2, just because I saw them and they looked interesting. Came with a USB boomerang, that was funny.
Oh yeah, I kept stealing that from you.
Because you think you're funny, yeah.
I am funny.
And then I also
funny
picked up...
looking. Ow. I'm dying.
Then I also
punched me.
Yeah,
abuse.
No one cares.
Sister abuse.
And then I also picked up Rune Factory 4 Special, Persona 5 Strikers, Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes, and then on the most recent trip I picked up the Mega Man ZX collection, Zero ZX collection, Catherine Full Body, and Pocky and Rocky Reshrined. So I've got a couple good games I'm looking forward to playing at some point. There's police sirens going on in the background.
Oh, yeah.
Not sure if anyone can hear that.
Bill heard them in the middle of the night in his sleep. Oh, dang. They're getting closer. What did you do, Bill?
No,
What did you do?
it's the losers at the car wash again, probably.
Oh, boy.
But anyways, so yeah, it's been a bit of a time. We actually got our tickets to, we're going to be seeing Dragon Ball Superhero pretty soon.
Woo! Can't
So-
wait. And then Red. One Piece film Red.
Yeah, tickets for that aren't on sale yet, though.
Yeah, it only premiered like yesterday. Like in Japan, so. But soon.
Yeah. But anyways, so other than that, nothing really too crazy. I'm currently drinking a ginger ale, in case anyone's interested, because we went food shopping and it was there.
Yes, and I'm drinking a hint. Peach flavored. I don't love the peach ones, but they come in the variety pack, so I accept them, but I don't love them.
Yes. Now, anyways, other than that, I mean, we've been catching up on the animes. We're watching Dragon Ball Super right now as a
Something to watch.
something to watch, and also as kind of like a prelude to the movie. So
Yeah.
that'll be good.
Woo!
And then, other than that, it's been pretty chill. But yeah, so I guess now getting into our topic for the day, we are going to be talking about the console wars.
The console wars.
Because when it comes to video games, there's always going to be competition. And
Yep.
the console wars, to me, is one of the most fascinating kind of like in the background things with video games during the entire, like, all the generations. So as long as there's been video games, we've always, obviously competition is healthy for any industry to thrive.
Yep.
Because if everything was just on one thing, and there'd be no innovation. Because what fuels competition and what basically one of the things that competition fuels is innovation. Because you need to always be constantly one-upping
Up your
competitors. So the console wars is a interesting topic in itself because it's been going on since the start of video games, but it really has had its particular moments where it's been more well known than others.
Yep.
And what makes it fun is the fact that when you actually look at the grand scheme of things of every generation, out of the 9 generations we've had,
Yep.
one fascinating little nugget I noticed, with the exception of the 4th generation, which we'll get to later, the most powerful system never wins, technically. It's always like one of the weaker ones, but that does more with what it has than one of the more powerful systems that struggles to really find.
Like the current winner right now.
Well, we'll get to that.
Oh,
But
okay.
so anyways, yeah, we're probably going to have to start back in the 1st generation. Now, there's a lot of different like methods of actually chronicling the console wars. The current article I'm using for my research is the TV Tropes page, just because it's well laid out.
Mm-hmm.
But there's like multiple books and like series talking about the console wars in themselves in bigger detail.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the 1st generation, which is basically, it lasted around 1972 to 1979, and it was mostly known as the Pong generation.
Yep.
Because we still hadn't really figured out what consoles were, per se.
Nope.
And when you talk about the 1st generation, obviously the consoles that stick out the most are Pong and the Magnavox Odyssey, which was the first technical video game console for its time.
Yep.
Now, if you want to be technical with this generation, I guess the Odyssey won by default because it was the only real designated console.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really want to say it more, I guess the problem with Pong was there were so many different versions of Pong that it's really hard to like
Yeah.
determine which one truly sold the best. I assume Atari's home version sold the best, but it's really unclear. So this generation is probably the most like kind of throwaway, kind of laughable, in a sense. Because then we move on to Generation 2. Now here's where things got interesting. So Generation 2 lasted officially from 1976 to 1985, although if you want to be technical, it was still going into the freaking 90s because of a certain console that wouldn't die.
Yep.
And the big competition here was the Atari 2600, which is one of like the first real video game consoles that comes to mind when you think video game console, like with its classic controllers and like cartridge design.
Yep.
And there was a lot of competition during this era. Like there was the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, the Odyssey 2, the Vectrex, the Bally Astro K, the RCA Studio 2, the Fairchild Channel F, among many others. And this one was interesting because the 2600 really won by a pretty big margin.
Yeah.
But we started getting that interesting period of innovation where, like, we had obviously the ColecoVision and Intellivision, which were very advanced systems for the time. Like, the Intellivision itself was a 16-bit console in like the early 8-bit era, but it really, obviously bits don't mean graphical power.
Yeah.
Despite common misconception. But it did have a surprisingly powerful processor for the time. Unfortunately, the problem with the Intellivision and ColecoVision was there was really the problem with this era was there was so many games and there was no quality control, and unfortunately those two systems had terrible controllers.
Yeah, because they had one of the ones that almost looks like a cell phone.
Yeah, like a phone.
Like a old chunky cell phone from like the 80s. Like that's what they looked like, where they had keypads and then like a weird joystick or something.
Yeah.
It was just like a weird knob too for one of them, I think.
Yeah,
I might be thinking of a Pong console. Too,
maybe.
But
I mean,
I know they weren't good. They definitely had the keypads.
Yeah, the keypad era. What's funny is I think theoretically the ColecoVision was the most powerful system of this era, and the ColecoVision itself is a very impressive like console if you like in terms of consoles from this era.
Yep.
The problem is though, it was just like there was so much garbage flying around. And the video game crash of '83, like the American video game crash, basically killed off every system here, because this was still like the American era where all these systems were made in America.
Yeah.
Like we hadn't really seen the Japanese gaming scene take off yet. So yeah, the 2600 clear, like night and day was this generation was won by, even though the 2600's 2600 itself is not that impressive of a system.
No.
Like, it's very basic. Like, I think it's only more powerful than the Fairchild Channel F, which itself was very basic, although that in itself was an interesting system because it technically was the first one with cartridges, but it had no real games. That was the problem. Because Atari had their arcade games, which gave it a decent, like, margin. Because I mean, the Intellivision and ColecoVision were miles better systems, but they had such poor controls and like.
Yeah, and all the games were basically just copies of the Atari games, right?
A lot of them were. I mean, there were some originals. Like the ColecoVision had like the best port of Donkey Kong at the time.
Oh, Donkey Kong?
Yeah, that was the launch title for the ColecoVision.
Huh?
Because they had a partnership with Nintendo. Because I believe it or not, Coleco made the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong, and they made it like deliberately shit.
Yep.
Just because they wanted their version to look better.
Huh.
That's actually partially how Nintendo got their start, because that was where the Donkey Kong lawsuit happened.
Huh.
Where Universal tried to sue.
Why'd you sue King Kong?
Because it was the quote-unquote copyright infringement of King Kong, but then it was determined that King Kong was actually public domain, and yeah, it was...
Public domain is so interesting. Like,
yeah, and it's amazing
how...
how...
do a whole podcast on just things public domain and like how things are now entering the public domain.
Yeah, and how Disney is still desperately trying to keep Mickey Mouse out of the public domain.
Yeah, they lost Pooh Bear though. I don't know if you guys have seen like the Winnie the Pooh horror movie, but that's because Winnie the Pooh is now in public domain.
Yep.
That would be an interesting podcast.
Maybe at some point. But yeah, so the Gen 2 was basically one-sided. It was Atari pulling through. And then we get to the third generation, which is... This is where things finally start to get interesting. So 83 to 91, technically. I mean, you want to be technical, the freaking Master System lasts fucking forever. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still kind of in production. Yeah, more on that later. But, yeah, so the big fighters here were obviously the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the Famicom in Japan.
Yep. And
the NES essentially saved the video game market.
Huh.
In a lot of ways. In America, anyways. Because
in
America. Yeah, because a lot of people always forget that the gaming crash only happened in America. Like, it never happened in Europe. Japan was fine the entire way through. So a lot of people always, when the crash gets brought up, they always think... A lot of, like, I know, like, Europeans, they usually are like, what crash? There was never a crash. or like the Japanese. It never happened in there.
Yeah.
But you got to remember, the American market is a huge market, which is, and a lot of the games were coming from America at the time.
Yep.
But anyways, so Nintendo finally would break over into the U.S. and basically would they would basically get a stranglehold on the market.
Yeah.
Which a lot of ways was good, a lot of ways not so good. They definitely had quality control in mind this time around, because all the games had to be approved by Nintendo to come out.
Yeah.
Not anyone could make a game for the Nintendo.
Well, and if they did, they were bootlegs, and they
were not so much bootlegs, they were unlicensed.
They were unlicensed by Nintendo, and they were all shit.
No, they weren't all shit, because the Tengen games were really good, because they were just Atari games, but they were not officially licensed games, and they actually went around Nintendo's lockout code chips, which is a story in itself, how that happened. But yeah, so this was also the generation where we finally got to see the introduction of Sega to the mix. Because Sega initially came out.
Sonic! Well, not Sonic yet.
No.
He doesn't appear until Genesis.
Yeah.
But
Sega came in first with the SG-1000, which only released in Japan, I want to say. And the SG-1000, for all intents and purposes, was just a Master System. A ColecoVision, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
They're very similar hardware.
That's funny.
But the more well-known system of Sega's from this era was the Master System, which was actually more powerful than the NES by a decent amount. Not so much musically, but hardware-wise, it was a very impressive system for the time. We also got Atari's 7800, which was originally supposed to release way earlier, but it was shelved, and then it eventually came out, but by the time it came out, it was so behind. And we also started seeing, like, the microcomputers at this point.
Mini?
Not so much like that. It was more like just early, like, computers, kind of like the Commodore 64, the MSX2, the ZX Spectrum, like all sorts of these like different computers, particularly in Europe. That's where a lot of Europe's gaming scene was, and they were so much more powerful than consoles. But the problem was they weren't nearly as accessible at the time.
Yes.
So a lot of people like who got into gaming via the PC era didn't quite like get the same recognition as like say like the console stuff, like with Nintendo and like Sega at the time. It's funny though, because while Nintendo was basically the dominant force this generation, in terms of like sales, with basically having a stranglehold on America and Japan.
Yes.
Europe and particularly South America are very fascinating, because Europe was honestly more Sega oriented.
Yeah.
Like Europe had a huge like Sega following. Like the Master System was pretty big over there at the time. And Brazil it was always famous for, it had like this weird, I guess import rates in Brazil are absurdly high. So they actually, like, the Master System ended up being like a long running system in Brazil for years, because they had a company in Brazil called Tectoy who would make Master Systems there and be able to sell them for cheap. So the Master System actually lasted like way longer than it had any right to in Brazil for the time. But yeah, for the third generation Nintendo, the NES was by like a wide margin, and it like
winner.
Like previous generations, it was not the most powerful system on the market. It was actually pretty average. Developers could do miracles with the NES, especially with like added like bonus like hardware and chips and stuff.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the NES was not spectacularly ahead of its time compared to, especially like the Master System or any of those micro PCs at the time. Now, moving on, now we get probably the most famous of the console war. This is like the definitive console war that is always known and pointed out between everybody, and this is the fourth generation, which the 16-bit wars.
16-bit.
Now, obviously, so this is where I things get a little complicated. So obviously, the big ones of this era were the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis. Well, the Super Nintendo, aka the Super Famicom.
Yep.
And the
oh yeah, I forgot.
Genesis, aka Mega Drive. And and then the third side, and probably the most obscure, was the NEC TurboGrafx 16, aka the PC Engine.
Oh, yeah.
So, the Genesis and the TurboGrafx were actually the first two to hit the market. And the TurboGrafx was interesting because it was actually extremely popular in Japan. And believe it or not, it wasn't actually a true 16-bit console.
No?
It was only an 8-bit, but it had like impressive like additional hardware that bumped it up to basically being quote-unquote 16-bit. And the Genesis actually came out shortly after. Like, I believe the Genesis, because this generation was 1987 to 1996.
Yep.
And the Genesis came out in 89, I want to say, 88, 89. And this is where the famous, like, in-your-face, like, advertising started appearing. Like, the big, like, kind of, like... So this was, like, the point of, like, in-your-face, like, taking shots at your competitors' advertising.
Oh, yeah.
Like the famous Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Which... So a big misconception with that trailer in particular is that it's directed at the Super Nintendo. That is not the case. That commercial was strictly directed at the original Nintendo. Because it was still... The Super Nintendo wouldn't come out till 91.
Yep.
So... That commercial is 100% right in every aspect. Like, because the Genesis was better than the NES in every way. Because it was a much more powerful system. 16-bit hardware.
Yep.
Basically, a lot of arcade, like Sega arcade ports were coming out.
Yep.
And the system had some impressive sprite graphics and, like, a big, huge controller. Super in-your-face. Like, this was the point where Sega's whole, like, in-your-face advertising really started.
Yeah.
Like, with the whole, like, they weren't trying to be Nintendo. They were trying to be, we're better than Nintendo.
We are better than you.
Like, the whole, like, we're not for kids. We're the adult console. Like, we have all these awesome sports games. We have Michael Jackson.
Yep.
All sorts of, like, crazy stuff like that. Now, believe it or not, the Sega has always struggled to, like, just do well in their mainland Japan. Yep. Believe it or not. Because
that's funny.
During this time, Sega was in a really weird place. So during, like, with the Master System, like, believe it or not, the people who were, like, handling distribution and marketing for the Master System in America at the time was Tonka.
Tonka?
Tonka.
Like the truck?
Yes.
Like, Tonka.
Tonka
like
toys.
That
Tonka toys. So...
That's pretty funny.
After the third generation, Sega was always weird. Sega actually in reality was like 3 different companies during this point.
Oh, okay.
There was Sega of Japan,
yep.
Sega of America, and Sega of Europe. And all 3 of them had very different philosophies with how to market their systems.
Yep.
And this was the point, and the other worst part is they all hated each other.
Oh boy.
Like, they could not stand each other.
Yep.
Because obviously a lot of it had to do with the whole Japanese pride. And unfortunately, Sega did not do well in Japan.
That's funny.
Like, during this generation, the TurboGrafx, the PC Engine in Japan was kicking Sega's ass the whole time. And it was Europe and America that really saw Sega...
keeping the Sega alive.
Yeah, well, this was the point where Sega finally broke out in America, because they were already popular in Europe.
Yeah.
But this was where it really kind of, like, hit it. They hit it off in America with all their in-your-face advertising, these really awesome games. No, not yet. Sonic still wasn't a thing yet. Nope. Sonic didn't debut till 91.
What? That's crazy.
Yeah. So I guess getting into that, we get the introduction of the Super Nintendo.
Yes.
And to combat the Super Nintendo, this is where we got Sonic, who was Sega finally established a mascot of sorts for their company. Because let's face it, Alex Kidd wasn't selling systems.
No.
And Sonic was he was essentially in a lot of ways the anti-Mario.
Yep.
He was the cool, edgy 90s mascot.
He was the edgelord. And
it was also the point where, so here we get to another advertising kind of stunt that Sega pulled during this era, and it was blast processing, which was both somewhat an exaggeration, but also kind of true. So I've apparently read that blast processing was actually a special, like, thing that the Genesis could do that wasn't actually related to what a lot of people associate it with. Mm-hmm. It had something to do with, like, really high detailed sprites or some weird shit like that. But the more common interpretation of blast processing was the speed of the Genesis. because the Genesis was always hyped up as like it was faster than the Super Nintendo, which when you actually break it down processor-wise, the Genesis was faster than the Super Nintendo.
Yep.
It had a very quick processor for the time, which is why a lot of Genesis games are just quicker in general than Super Nintendo.
Yep.
And the advertising took this and ran with it. With their crazy like advertising campaigns, and Sonic was kind of the edgy, in-your-face mascot that Sega needed for the time.
Yeah, and then they made him a band.
Well, he did actually. That was an idea at one point.
Ew, wait, for a game?
No, not a game. Sonic's early like pre-creation, like before the first game came out, he had like a girlfriend at one point who was like a blonde human.
Oh.
And like he was in a band.
Oh.
This was real. Yeah.
I'm kind of glad they didn't.
No, they dropped most of that. Although one of the members of his band was Vector, so they reused that in him.
Vector. I'm sorry, Vector's just he's a stupid character.
Yeah, but yeah. So Genesis versus eventually the Super Nintendo came out, and right from the bat it was like super hyped. Mm-hmm. Although one thing the Genesis had that gets kind of forgotten was the Genesis was actually fully backwards compatible with the Sega Master System, like inherently hardware design, because all the Master System components were inside the Genesis.
Yeah.
They used them for different things in the Genesis, but it made it truly backwards compatible. The only problem was it didn't have the cartridge slot didn't match.
Yeah.
So they had to they came out with this converter that basically just changed the cartridge slot to the Master System style, which was a nice touch. I mean, it was a thing that they could say they had.
Yeah.
Especially because the Super Nintendo was not backwards compatible, and that was a controversial thing at the time. Because a lot of parents were mad that they had to buy this whole new system and they couldn't play their old games.
Oh.
But anyways, so this generation was pretty down to the wire. I want to say, like, this is the closest one that there ever was.
Yeah.
Like, because Sega actually did have a lead at one point during this generation. Unfortunately, eventually Sega did what Sega does best, and
it fucks up.
Pretty much, like so the Sega CD came out as a thing to kind of like
life support.
No, not really, not yet. The Sega CD wasn't a failure. It wasn't it wasn't a spectacular success, but it wasn't a failure. It still sold a good amount of units.
Yeah.
And had some really solid games. The problem is that a lot of people forget about those in favor of all the full motion video crap.
Yeah.
But the Sega CD did actually help the Genesis. Like, it allowed it to have like better music, better sprite scaling capabilities. It put it a bit closer on par with what the Super Nintendo could do.
Yeah.
Because the Super Nintendo was the introduction of like all these like added like bonus chips and like additional hardware. Like you could do the Mode 7 stuff, like with the rotating sprites.
Yep.
There was the 3D capabilities, which the Genesis also had its own version of, called the Sega Virtual Processor, which was a competitor to Sega's Super FX chip. Nintendo's Super FX chip, which was very early 3D at the time. But the reason, now going back when I said every generation the most powerful system doesn't win, the reason I have an asterisk on Gen 4 is, so there were more systems in this generation. There was the Philips CDI, which we know about.
Yep.
The Amstrad GX 4000, the SNK Neo Geo, the Super 8-can, the Commodore 64 GS, a whole bunch of random shit. One of these systems in particular, the Neo Geo, you want to be technical, was more powerful than the Super Nintendo. But the Neo Geo was a premium system that was essentially an arcade machine consoleized.
Yeah. And that was the one with the giant
cartridges, the giant controller. Each game cost $200. It was a premium system for the household.
Yep.
So technically it's more powerful, but it also it was in a weird place. So I always put an asterisk on this generation, because the Super Nintendo, in terms of the consoles that mattered, was the most powerful, had the most games, had like some of the best games, most variety, like super accessible, pretty much it's one of the most well-known systems of all time.
Yep.
The thing is, though, I will say the Genesis had a lot going for it. Like Sega had some of their best like first-party work, because Sega was a first-party machine at the time.
Yep. With
all the games that they created. But yeah, eventually the SNES wins this one, but the Genesis, this was the closest competition so far. So then next...
It's funny thinking about it, but like the two other main consoles right now that are in the current race, we haven't even brought up yet.
No.
Which is pretty funny.
There's only one name that's been around very early, and that's Nintendo.
Yep.
So, yep. Now, getting into... So before we get to the 5th generation, we have to talk about so the 5th generation technically started in 93.
Yep.
During the 4th.
Yep.
And so a lot of people like to claim that these aren't 5th generation consoles, they were in between steps, which I can see your point, but I don't like doing in between shit like that. I like to keep everything I can't talk. I like to keep everything strictly split between one generation to the other.
Yep.
So the start of the 5th generation was kind of like a false start because they started very early with a bunch of systems. And we had the early 5th generation systems like the 3DO, the Jaguar, the Pioneer Laser Active, the Amiga CD32, FM Towns Marty, the Virtual Boy, a whole bunch of different systems. And they were all technically next-gen systems. Like the 3DO was 32-bit, the Jaguar was debatably 64-bit.
Yep.
The Virtual Boy was 32-bit, the Amiga CD32 was obviously 32-bit. Most of these didn't come out in America. And the most well-known from this era are obviously the Jaguar and the 3DO. And the Virtual Boy. What's interesting, though, out of all these systems, the only company that still survived after this debacle was Nintendo with the Virtual Boy. But that's for another topic entirely. What's funny, though, is the 3DO technically was the best-selling of this generation because it still sold like 2 million units.
Oh, wow.
It was just stupidly expensive, and as much as I personally adore the 3DO...
Yeah, it was really fun.
There's no reason to own one anymore because pretty much every game that's worth playing on it is on something else.
Yeah.
I mean, even... I mean, we've done episodes on them in the past, the 3DO and the Jaguar, and how much we secretly...
The Jaguar is just superior. Especially to the N64.
Yeah.
It's way better in every way. Anyways.
But yeah, so these systems are technically 5th generation.
Fight me.
But I can't. You can't really say they were ever truly in the console war.
Yeah.
Because they basically existed. There was also the Sega 32X from this point, which was basically life support.
Yeah.
And it was a colossal failure, and they also literally announced that it was obsolete the second it came out, in a lot of ways. Because it was Sega of America versus Sega of Japan.
Yeah.
But yeah. Now we move on to quite possibly the most well-known. But before we get on to that, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Yeet.
And we're back.
We're back.
So, continuing on
But
now.
we're not here to stay. We're moving.
Anyways, so next we get quite possibly my favorite generation of all time. The 5th generation of gaming. Also known as the 32-bit, 64-bit era, or the 3D era. Now, went from 94 to 2001, although technically it was more like 93 to 2001 if you want to count the first systems of this era. But this is where we get quite possibly the last true, in my opinion, hardware race.
Yep.
Because this was probably the last true generation where every system was legitimately different from both a hardware and a game output standpoint.
Yep.
So the big players of this generation were the PlayStation 1, a newcomer, the Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64. There was also minor systems like the Apple Pippin.
Yep.
Yeah, Apple made a console. It was bad.
Bad.
And the NEC PCFX, which was the last, probably one of the last like systems to come out from the PC Engine before they went under. But so this generation is fascinating because a lot of this was the beginning of Nintendo's brief kind of downfall.
Yep.
Because they had been on top of the world the last 2 generations. They still owned. We haven't even gotten to handhelds yet, but they owned the handheld scene, and they were literally on top of the world. They had a brief stumble with the Virtual Boy, but we already know about the Virtual Boy. We've talked about it in the past.
Yeah, it's not as bad as people
No,
say.
it's just it was unfinished.
Yeah.
But Nintendo's the whole start of Nintendo's downfall, and Sega's to a degree, was all Nintendo's fault.
Oh no.
Because Nintendo literally created their worst nightmare.
Yep.
Because so obviously Sega CD came out. The CD technology was like the new big thing, and obviously everybody was like trying to jump on the thing because TurboGrafx had their CD add-on, Sega had theirs. Obviously,
Yep.
Nintendo was curious about getting into the medium because the CD was superior to the cartridge in a lot of ways, mostly in terms of cost. But so Nintendo kind of reached out to Sony, who was making the Super Nintendo sound card at the time.
Yep.
And they kind of started a deal to make the CD add-on for the system. Well, what happened was Nintendo really didn't read the contract they signed very well. And Sony...
Is that surprising?
No, not really. But Sony would go basically... Sony was kind of being sneaky, which, I mean...
I mean, if they can get away with it... I mean...
Literally, Nintendo could have said no, but they decided not to check.
Yeah.
So basically what Sony did was they made it so that they would get the sole profits from all the CD technology and CD games, and Nintendo would basically get nothing. Mm-hmm. And Nintendo was like, whoa, wait a minute.
Wait a gosh darn second.
Now, rather than, doing the smart thing and renegotiating the contract,
Yep.
Nintendo decides to be equally as sneaky and go behind Sony's back.
Oh no.
And instead would hire Philips, their direct competitor, to make a CD add-on.
The Philips CD.
No, that was not really related to the thing.
But it will be born from this, right?
No. The CDI was going to be made regardless.
Oh, okay.
We'll get to what Philips got out of this. That's a bit of a misconception. The CDI didn't have any, was actually something that was going to be made regardless.
Interesting.
But so Nintendo goes behind Sony's back, hires Philips to make the CD add-on. And then as Sony does their press conference announcing the Nintendo PlayStation CD add-on thing, Nintendo goes up on stage and basically goes, don't listen to them, they're idiots. We have a project with Philips instead. Embarrasses Sony on stage. And Sony, literally the head of the guy who designed the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, he also designed the Super Nintendo sound card. He basically went up to the president of Sony at the time and basically said, it's not going to end like this, we'll make our own.
Yeah.
And that was the start of the birth of the PlayStation.
Oh, wow. Damn,
Which
they
is
really actually did that?
Yeah. Nintendo is 100% responsible for Sony joining the market. What's funny is, though, Nintendo actually had the copyrights for PlayStation.
Yep.
Play space station. So to get around this, Sony just took out of the space PlayStation. Because copyrights are fun like that.
Yep.
Now, at the same time, though, with this... So obviously PlayStation's brewing.
Yep.
Nintendo is not super concerned, but they don't realize what they've done. And then there's Sega. And Sega during this era was... Oh, Sega.
Oh, Sega.
So, as we brought up earlier, the Sega 32X was the American branch's way of keeping the still successful Genesis afloat for a little longer.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Japan was secretly working on a successor console called the Saturn, which was going to be the successor. And they weren't really working well with Sega of America, of course, because they hated each other.
Why would they?
And during this point, there was actually... Sega of America was actually kind of working on their own next-gen console as well, which they kind of signed a deal with this company called Silicon Graphics, who were a very ahead of their time computer company at the time.
Yep.
And they kind of designed this spec for a 64-bit system that was very powerful, very easy to program for, and would have been a snap to make 3D games.
Yeah.
The problem is when they proposed this to Sega of Japan, who were already making the Saturn, said no.
Yep.
Because they had already... They didn't create it, and they weren't going to let Sega of America get the praise.
Yeah.
So I've heard debates on this, but I believe from what I've read is the president of Sega of America at the time, Tom Kalinske, who was on his way out, basically, at this point.
Yep.
He basically told Silicon Graphics, we can't use this, but you should take it to one of our competitors. And from what I've read, that system later went on to become the N64. So another interesting
The
part of
worst console ever.
yeah. But what's interesting though is during this point, the Saturn was initially supposed to be a 2D powerhouse. Like
Yep.
it was going to have very rudimentary 3D capabilities, and was going to be like strictly like the ultimate 2D video game console.
Yep.
Then they saw what Sony was doing, which is funny because what got everyone excited about 3D gaming was actually Sega's Virtual Fighter in arcades. And Sega basically freaked out, and rather than redesigning the system from scratch,
Yep.
like you think would make sense, they instead just slapped on another processor
Yep.
and called it a day, which made the Saturn notoriously hard to make, difficult to program for.
Oh boy.
Then we get to the final reveal, where so obviously the N64 at this time was still known as the Ultra 64, and it was still quite a ways out. But everyone knew it was going to be a cartridge-based system still, because Nintendo is CD Nintendo is, ever since this incident, has been CD phobic.
Yep.
Oh yeah, because ironically the Philips CD add-on never came out either.
Yep.
But because of the Philips partnership, this is what you're thinking of. Because of the Philips partnership, Philips got the rights to use Nintendo franchises on some of their on their little the CDI, their quote unquote video game console. So that's where Hotel Mario and the
Hotel Mario
and the Zelda CDI games came from. But
freaking love those.
So
They're
obviously
so
the
stupid.
the
And it made many a YouTube poop.
yeah. So obviously the Super Nintendo CD never happened.
No.
And Nintendo kind of like had this weird like phobia of CDs for a long time after this.
They're scary.
So the N64 is basically announced, but it's announced that it's not going to be out for a bit.
Yep.
PlayStation is the first one that's really showing anything off. So one of the first, I believe it was actually the first E3. This is one of the most infamous, like this was probably one of Sega's worst moments. Mm-hmm. They come out and they announce the Saturns. They show off the Saturn, and their press conference wasn't bad.
Yeah.
Like it was pretty cool. Showed off the Saturn. It looked pretty cool. I mean,
Yep.
pretty powerful for the time. Cool 3D graphics, awesome 2D graphics. And then they announced the price, which was like
$1 million.
no, it was like $399, so $400, which was a lot for the time, admittedly.
Yeah.
And then they did their biggest blunder
Oh boy.
of all time. They announced right then and there that the Saturn was officially out as of now.
What?
Right when they basically said it's now out, you can get one right now. But they did also forgot to inform the retailers or the game developers making games for it about this.
Oh.
So a lot of retailers didn't have stock, and a lot of them, particularly KB Toys, just flat out were so pissed off from this, they flat out refused to release games for the Saturn. They refused to release Saturn stuff, like Sega stuff in general. Like they just cut off Sega entirely.
Oh dang.
Pissed off a lot of developers because a lot of the games weren't ready. Like no one had. They were trying to get ahead of Sony.
Oh my god.
But then what makes it even worse is Sony comes out. The guy doing the Sony press conference gets out on stage and utters one sentence that literally was pretty much the nail in the coffin for Sega.
What?
He got up on stage, looked at the crowd, and just said, $299.
Ah.
Yeah. One of like the biggest just kick them while they're down moments ever.
Damn. Is that all he said? Did he do like the mic drop?
Basically, yeah, he was.
Oh my God.
You can find the video on YouTube. It is the greatest fucking thing ever. He literally gets just on stage, addresses the crowd, and just goes, $299, and then it's just the crowd blows up. Like it was insane.
That's so.
And it's funny because when the PlayStation eventually did come out, it wasn't quite the like immediate success which some people think it was.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit slow start. Like it was. Eventually, good word of mouth and a bunch of great software were what
Well, because
really.
it was a new cop, brand new.
Yeah.
Brand new.
No one really thought Sony could pull it off.
Yeah.
Essentially,
But they did.
but they had a shit ton of great developers like making games for it, and then the most infamous, Nintendo's other big mistake,
Yeah.
sticking to cartridges, because
Ah.
that scared away so many developers, including the most infamous one being Squaresoft,
Oh.
who
Oh.
were a stubbornly loyal Nintendo developer forever.
Yeah.
And they just, unfortunately, RPGs, which were admittedly still underground at this point,
Yep.
RPGs just couldn't. What they wanted to do with future RPGs, they could not do on a cartridge as limited as the N64 was.
Yep.
So they jumped ship to went to PlayStation because PlayStation had compact discs. You could do more with a compact, because a compact disc could hold, well, an N64 cartridge could hold 64 megabytes.
Yep.
A compact disc could hold 64 thousand megabytes or something like that.
Huh.
Like significantly more space. Plus, you could put stuff on multiple discs. Couldn't really do multiple cartridges.
No.
So, the other big mistake Nintendo had. Plus, their system came out very late into the market, and Sony had already developed a big lead at this point
Yes.
with all their, like, Crash Bandicoot was like the big star game. They had Spyro. They had all sorts of stuff. RPGs, Final Fantasy VII RPGs finally were mainstream.
Yeah.
And this was the real beginning of the end of Sega and the start of Nintendo's not like one of the weirder eras of Nintendo. Because I get you. We get she doesn't like it. It's a joke at this point. The N64 though is still a very well made console that has some very phenomenal games on it. Even if the system itself is very flawed in its design.
Yep.
But this was like one of the biggest like curb stomps ever because PlayStation was so far ahead this generation. Like Sega gave up on the Saturn early, like
Yeah.
which is funny because the Saturn was actually successful in Japan. It was like the only instance of like Sega's console being more successful in Japan than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Because the Saturn was their baby.
Yeah.
Plus the Saturn had so many games over in Japan that did not make it to America because they weren't doing any of the 2D RPGs, none of the 2D platform, basically none of the games that were really great on the Saturn made it over to America.
Yep.
Which was a damn shame. But yeah, so the Saturn basically and it also didn't have a mainline Sonic game. Because Sonic Extreme was a dumpster fire of development.
Oh, yeah.
That never came out, even though I don't think it would have saved the Saturn because the game honestly looked like a pain in the ass to play.
Oh, no.
But yeah, so PlayStation was like the new face of video games at this point because they also kept up the whole adult scene because there really wasn't any adult oriented games on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
I mean this N64. Like a great idea of this generation that a lot of people have pointed out was when it came to your average PlayStation owner. You could just find like 3 different PlayStation owners, and each one of them would have a different selection of games and memories.
Yeah.
You could find 3 N64 owners, and a lot of the times they would all have the same basic games they played and same memories.
Yeah.
Like it was a very different time. It also didn't help too that all 3 systems were designed very differently and handled 3D very differently.
Yeah.
Which resulted in it was very hard to port games from system to system reliably.
Yeah.
So there was only a handful of games. I can only think of 2 off the top of my head that actually released on all 3.
Oh, really?
Duke Nukem 3D was on all 3, and Mortal Kombat Trilogy. There's probably another one, but those are the 2 I can think of off the top of my head. But yeah, so this was the beginning of Sony's dominance in the console market. Because then we move on to Generation 6, which Generation 6 was the beginning of online gaming, and also like 3D was finally like out of that awkward phase.
Yeah.
Like I always see like every era, like you have like the beginning, like the 8-bit era was like the early awkward phase of like sprite graphics, and then we got to 16-bit, which they kind of got out of its awkwardness, and then the 32-bit era was where they perfected the 2D look.
Yeah.
This is around the point where I'd say like the 3D era kind of got out of their awkward early phase, but they were still kind of like they could still improve.
Mm-hmm.
So the 6th generation was 1998 to 2006. Although you can be technical, it went on to 2016 because the PlayStation 2 wouldn't die.
Yep.
So the big players in this generation were the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the another newcomer, the Xbox.
The Xbox.
Microsoft's first entry.
Dun dun dun.
So, also keep in mind the last generation, the N64 was the most powerful and the PlayStation was not, and it won. So, another case of that. But, so this generation, the first system out was the Dreamcast, Sega's final console and their swan song in a sense.
Yep.
And the Dreamcast was pretty impressive for the time, even if its controller was. I like it from it for some reasons, but I will admit it's not the greatest controller ever made.
No.
Especially for fighting games, which is funny because the Dreamcast was a fighting game machine.
Yeah, we mostly play fighting games when we did our
fighting and
Dreamcast
racing
episode.
games.
Yeah.
Because Sega had a shit ton of fighting and racing
But
games.
they had a party game. Sonic. With cards.
Yeah.
Shuffle. Sonic Shuffle. That's what it is.
So the Dreamcast was awesome in a lot of ways because it was the first system to really introduce online play. It had 4 controller ports built in the front. It was to me, it was the last true.
It also had Seaman.
Yes, it did. Leonard Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy.
But it was, to me, it was the last real gamers console in a lot of ways. That was like meant for everyone.
Yep.
The problem is Sega was so in the toilet by this point, and they would have. The sad part is the hype of the PlayStation was just. The PlayStation 2 was just insurmountable.
Yeah.
Because the Dreamcast honestly was similar to the Genesis, where it really fought. It was more designed to compete with the PlayStation and N64 than it was the PlayStation 2. And PlayStation 2 came out. So Dreamcast came out in 98, 99 in America.
Yeah.
PlayStation 2 came out in 2000. And here's a fun thing about the PlayStation 2. I don't think anyone can remember a launch game for it.
PlayStation 2. No.
No.
No, I couldn't tell you.
But the PlayStation 2 had one thing that was the game changer of this generation.
Okay.
It was also a DVD player.
Oh yeah.
The majority of people who bought PlayStation 2s early on were because of the DVD player.
That was such a good idea.
You also got to keep in mind, it was the cheapest DVD player on the market.
Oh my god.
And it also played games.
That is so. I never really thought about that, but that is.
Because you got to remember, DVD players were expensive as shit back then.
Oh yeah, back in the day, like I mean DVDs, because like that was like now we're in like kind of that DVD to Blu-ray phase, but like back then it was VCR to DVD, so a big chunky box to a disc, like.
But the players were
Dang.
expensive, and Sony basically sold the PlayStation 2 at a loss, but included the DVD player. Because I can tell you, I don't know, so we're not even going to mince words here. The PlayStation 2 obliterated the field with this console war.
Yeah.
And I can tell you what, everybody had a PlayStation 2 back in the day for the most part. And the majority of people I knew had one, but they didn't have any games for it.
Huh.
It was the family DVD player.
Yeah.
Because it was cheap.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it worked.
Because we lived in a very Nintendo-centric area.
Yeah.
Or even then, it was either Nintendo or Xbox. Like, PlayStation wasn't the biggest thing. I don't know how many times I'd go to a friend's house and be like, oh, let's play some PS2. Oh, you have no games? Okay, I'll go grab some games.
Yeah.
But yeah, so PlayStation 2, like, immediately had such a dominating lead. And some people make the claim that if the Dreamcast had a DVD player, it might have been able to compete. And Sega was just too in the toilet at that point. Like,
Yeah.
they
made some not good decisions.
Unfortunately, when they finally got it right, their past was catching up on them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Blah, blah,
But yeah, PlayStation 2 was already dominating by this point. And eventually we get the GameCube comes out. And the GameCube is an interesting console because...
Yeah. They weren't last place.
No, they were... Well,
the Sega Dreamcast.
they were last placed where it mattered.
Yeah.
Because the Dreamcast only lasted 2 years.
Yeah.
But the GameCube was interesting because they finally saw Nintendo move to discs. But they were mini discs.
Oh.
That still had
Oh, yeah.
And it still had a size problem, which led to issues with the GameCube later on. And they still had that inherently kiddie image to them, which hampered them, especially with the arrival of the newcomer.
Yeah.
The Xbox, Microsoft's big entry.
Dun, dun.
And Microsoft had a bit of a partnership with Sega at the time. Like, they were working on... they had some sort of a partnership with the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
Like, the Dreamcast was able to use, like, Microsoft stuff in its development. It didn't run off of Microsoft like some people think it does, but it had some options that were available,
Yep.
and a lot of Sega's franchises jumped over to the Xbox when it came along,
Yeah.
and the Xbox was really powerful. The problem is though, PlayStation just had PlayStation just had so many other games, and it was insane how like far they went, especially with all like the added like franchises and different things that they were doing at the time.
Yep.
And it's interesting because, in all honesty, like Microsoft came in second this generation in their first outing, but the only real reason they did was the introduction of Halo,
Ah.
their big killer app, because
Yep.
Microsoft tried a few like more traditional routes, like they had a quote unquote mascot called Blinks the Time Sweeper,
Oh yeah.
a decent enough game, but I mean it was really not. It wasn't on the same level as like Nintendo's mascot platformers or even Sony's big three of Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, Sly Cooper.
Yep.
That was really the big thing this generation, because these systems were all inherently pretty similar. Because this was probably the first real generation of multi-platform ports of most games, and we really still saw like big first-party commitment from like Sony and Nintendo. Microsoft to a lesser extent. They did this also saw the big point of Microsoft buying Rare though,
Yep.
along with a bunch of other studios to kind of build up their developers.
And they did like those rare reboots of it on the next console.
Not so much reboots. Like we had,
Well, they were like
they remade Conquer.
Oh,
And then,
just Conquer. Okay.
and then they did one original game called Grabbed by the Ghoulies, which was supposed to be It was actually a GameCube game that was brought over. But yeah. So this generation was fascinating. We also saw the introduction of, like I said, online gaming with Sega's initial online.
Yep.
Microsoft and the early days of Xbox Live, PlayStation had some online, and Nintendo also kind of had online. Theirs wasn't that impressive, but yeah, curb stomp battle from PlayStation though. Like they basically just kept on going, and Nintendo slipped even further down to third.
Yep.
Because it's crazy how, when you really think about it, how like unremarkable the GameCube actually was in the grand scheme of things. Now moving on, we get to another big console war in a lot of ways, the 7th generation, the HD motion control era, which ran from 2005 to 2013. And so there was only really 3 major competitors this time around.
Yep.
Sony would introduce their successor, the PlayStation 3.
Yep.
Nintendo would release their new revolutionary Nintendo Wii.
Yep.
And Microsoft would introduce their successor to the Xbox 360. And the 360 was actually the first one to make it on the market. So this gets very petty here, but it's actually pretty fascinating.
Oh no.
The president of Microsoft at the time, the game division anyways, was a guy named Peter Moore.
Yep.
And Peter Moore was the former head of Sega right at the end of Sega's time at the console wars. Like, he basically was leading the ship as it was sinking.
So he was drowning the ship, basically.
No.
He was sinking.
No. It was already going down. He just kind of
okay.
inherited it as it was going down.
Oh, okay.
And he got picked up by Microsoft. And the man was so bitter towards Sony for killing the Dreamcast that his goal with the Xbox 360 was to kill Sony. So he rushed it through development to get it out first so they could get the market share early.
Yep.
Unfortunately, they cut a lot of corners in development. And while the 360 got out a year before the PlayStation 3 or Wii,
Yep.
and did get a huge head start over the two, it also was the beginning of console hardware failures, which were a very common thing from here on out. And Microsoft,
The Red Ring of Death.
yes, Microsoft had the most infamous one of all with the Red Ring of Death.
It sprung parodies.
It sprung many things. It also cost Microsoft a lot of money fixing all those systems.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
And then, so Microsoft has a quick lead. I mean, and I'll give it credit. 360 is a cool console.
Yep.
First HD system, bunch of great games. Like, I love Sony, but I can't deny the 360 had a lot going for it. Now, Sony and Nintendo eventually make their releases, and Sony kind of, for the first time ever, has a bit of a misstep.
Oh, okay.
The PlayStation 3 is very powerful.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of like the Sega Saturn, very complicated. Had a very specifically designed processing unit that only Sony really had the grasp of at the time.
Oh no.
And it was infamously $599 US at launch.
Ooh.
Very
So
expensive.
a much bigger high from the $299 of before.
Yes, but here's the thing. It was the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market at the time because it introduced the Blu-ray technology.
Oh, true.
Unfortunately, Blu-ray players were absurdly expensive at the time, but even... So here's a combination of things. The Blu-ray player was expensive, and the early PS3 models had full-on PlayStation 2s inside of them to allow backwards compatibility.
Yep.
Something that was later cut from the system to save cost.
Yep.
And then we get the Wii. The Wii.
It's me! The Wii!
We would like to play.
Yeah!
So the Wii...
It's the Wii!
The Wii is probably... Thank you for that. So the Wii was very interesting as it kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Originally codenamed the Revolution, the Wii was first shown in a lot of trailers, and it was very hyped up for its motion controls.
Yeah.
Which were very new at the time, especially because it was by default motion control. It wasn't like an add-on.
Yeah.
The thing about the Wii, though, was the Wii was... They rather than trying to make the most powerful system they could, they instead opted to not focus on graphics or power, and instead focus on accessibility and fun. So the Wii was very much a slightly more powerful GameCube.
Yep.
But it had motion controls and a slew of very family-friendly, casual games at its launch. And it worked. The Wii was a smash hit. Like, you remember...
Yeah.
Every
person had a Wii.
Everybody wanted a Wii. Because it was... Everyone
yeah.
wanted to play Wii Sports.
Yeah.
Which is still really funny.
Or Mario Party.
Mario Party.
Mario Kart.
Mario Kart. All these games. Because it was just super cool. And it was honestly one of Nintendo's most creative moments.
Yeah.
So the Wii got a massive lead right away. It was also the cheapest system on the market, and it was the first console sold at a profit in years.
Huh.
Keep in mind, too, Nintendo was also dominating handhelds at this point.
Yeah.
With the DS, which is the second best-selling system of all time.
Yep.
So the majority... So this is the most interesting generation in terms of the console wars, because the majority of it was literally... Sony and Microsoft kind of going back and forth, Sony having a very slow start, Microsoft taking the quick lead, and then Nintendo just flying ahead.
Coming in.
The thing is, though, Nintendo got this massive lead, and then they kind of just stuttered, and really didn't continue on towards the second half of the generation.
Yeah.
But they were so far ahead that, like, literally, they were gonna...
They had it in the bag.
Pretty much. Because Sony and Microsoft fought tooth and nail at this point, and this was like one of this was like the first real, like, I want to call, like, the schoolyard console war.
Yeah.
Where, like, you got so many, like, fanboys on one side or the other, when in reality both systems were perfectly fine, and, like, there was no...
How expensive was the Wii?
I forget. I think it was like $299.
Oh, okay.
It was very affordable.
Yeah, especially compared to the $599 price of the PlayStation.
And I think the 360 was all... 360 had different price ranges. I think the 360 was pretty cheap as well, too. But it had severe hardware failure issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the PlayStation went through a number of redesigns over its time that dramatically lowered the price. Developers kind of figured out how to make games for it.
Yep.
And it started getting a ton of amazing first-party exclusives and third-party exclusives, which finally helped it kind of catch up to where Microsoft was. And eventually by the end, the PlayStation did actually beat the 360.
Oh, nice.
It's ironic that the 360 was the third place console that generation. But this generation also went on very long. Like,
yeah.
It's funny how short the sixth generation felt. because the HD era felt like it went on forever.
Yeah.
And eventually, of course, eventually the Wii, the generation would end, and it would kind of be, what was fascinating about this generation was, despite the Wii being so far ahead, this was like the closest fight we've really had in a long time.
Huh.
Like, because the PS3 and 360 sold a lot. It wasn't like they were like these like two schlubs in the background while one runs away. Yeah, the Wii was super far ahead, but the 360 and the PS3 were also pretty high up there.
Yeah.
And that would then lead into the 8th generation, which was... So we kind of... This is interesting to me, was graphically... The 8th generation was kind of like the all-in-one era in a lot of ways. Like, they were trying... These systems were trying to be everything in one.
Yeah.
Like entertainment centers. So we obviously would... Believe it or not, once again, like the first system out this era was actually Nintendo.
Yep.
With the Wii U. Oh, the Wii U. So many steps forward and so many more steps back.
Oh, no.
I think when we talked about the Wii U back in the day, I think we titled it, Sometimes You Just Gotta Hit Rock Bottom.
Yep.
The Wii U was the kick in the pants Nintendo really needed to finally get their shit together.
Yeah, to finally be like...
Realize that you can't pretend it's 1995
Nope.
anymore, and you have to finally
move on.
Innovate.
Yeah.
Because even the Wii, for all as successful as it was still such a behind-the-times system. Its online infrastructure was super behind. DLC wasn't a thing. It had cool downloadables.
Yeah.
Like, the Virtual Console was really cool, but besides that, like, it was so behind the times.
Yeah.
And which is one of the reasons why it kind of, like, flatlined towards the end.
Yeah.
So the Wii U was an attempt to finally address a lot of the problems that the Wii had, which was mostly the fact that it was the Wii was the casual system that was very much not hard for the hardcore.
Yeah.
Despite having some phenomenal games.
Yeah.
Now the Wii U was an attempt to rectify this because it was more powerful. It had a much better online infrastructure, and it was aiming for the hardcore crowd. The problem is, though, everything else.
Yep.
The system was powerful enough, but not exactly the most robust system in terms of processing power. It was like I think it was kind of like in between the 360 and the PS3. And its other big problem was its advertising.
Yeah.
The system was and its name.
Yeah.
First, because the majority of people at the time didn't even know it was a console. Everyone thought it was an add-on. Like the tablet was an add-on for the Wii.
Oh, it was just the add-on for the Wii.
And the Wii U name really... They were trying to, like... I get what they were trying to do with the whole, like, it's like the Wii, but it's also you're in control kind of thing. Unfortunately, they didn't... They were trying to keep those casual gamers. The problem was the casual gamers had already abandoned Nintendo years ago.
Yeah.
Because they all went on to mobile phones by this point.
No, true.
And no one was playing Wii anymore.
Nope.
So the Wii U immediately is struggling from day one. And it would be a very long struggle for Nintendo during this short period. Because the 8th generation is kind of split into two halves. The first half was the initial half, which lasted from 2012 to 2017.
Yep.
So then we get PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One.
Yep.
Still stupid name. A lot of dumb names this generation. Like PS4 had it right.
PS4, simple. Can't go wrong.
So...
Number 4.
Once again, this was another case of Sony literally not having to try and just running away with it. Because the PS4 was literally everything that the PS3 wasn't. It was super powerful, easy to program for, and had great games from the start.
Yep.
Microsoft this time around, though, made some big missteps. Like they... Infamously, they wanted to have the system always online. Like, it would check up on you to make sure you were online. If you weren't online, we would be able to play. You weren't going to be able to play used games.
Oh.
Yeah, that was...
Wait, used, like...
As in, you couldn't trade games with people. Each game would have like a key, like a PC game, where you'd have to enter, and you'd have to pay a fee if you bought a used game to unlock it on the system.
Oh.
Plus, it was absurdly expensive, and it had the Kinect thing that had to be...
It's a good thing they didn't end up doing that.
Oh, Sony literally made fun of them at the E3 that year. Like, they made this famous video of two Japanese Sony employees being like, "Hello, This is how you share your games. Here you go. Just handed the game over.
Yeah.
Like, it was... They literally saw everything Microsoft was doing. Were like, we're going to just make fun of them, this entire thing. PS4 was cheaper, like, competitive-wise. Didn't have any of that stupid BS.
Yeah.
Right from the start. Like, Sony basically won the generation right there.
Yeah.
It didn't help too. Microsoft was literally like, hey, no one wanted it for that
Yeah.
stuff. I mean, obviously, Microsoft immediately rescinded all of this.
Yeah.
Like,
Rightfully.
They backed down very fast.
Yep.
But yeah, so this generation was very much a curb stop by Sony once again. And the funny part is they didn't even have to try. The PS4 was just that far ahead. And it's funny how many houses you go to and you see and everyone has a PS4.
Yeah.
Like, it was such a popular system. Now, halfway through this generation, though, we kind of got like a second half in a sense.
Yep.
Which is called, I guess, Generation 8 Part 2, which saw the upgrade era, or like hybrid console era, as a lot of people said, and it ran from 2017 to 2020.
Yep.
So this would see Sony introduce the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X. And I think theoretically the Xbox One X was the most powerful system hardware-wise.
Yep.
But if we're going to be technical, the PlayStation 4 still won.
Yeah.
Well, it's to be determined because we got Nintendo's... So, Nintendo gave up on the Wii U around 2017
Yep.
because it was dying.
It was a failure.
It had a few brief moments of, like, hope with, like, Mario Kart 8
Yeah.
and Smash Brothers.
But
But
there's
for the
only
most...
so much light that can shine through a pile of shit.
You can only, like, keep the sinking... I mean, the Wii U itself
You
is
can only spray so much Febreze on it before it starts smelling.
The Wii U the Wii U is a fine console, but it was never gonna. It was basically like the N64 and GameCube once again.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was there was no hope for it. It was a sinking ship that was never gonna come back.
Yep.
So Nintendo went back to the drawing board and essentially created. They took basically what they were doing because. We're not going to talk about handhelds in this video. I'm just deciding now.
Yeah.
But the handheld
They'll
race.
complicate things too much.
Let's be real here. The handheld console wars are the most hilariously one-sided thing you'll ever see because it's just Nintendo curb stomping everyone. So Nintendo literally took everything they knew with their handhelds and just decided we're going to take that and apply it to a console.
Yeah.
So they created a very powerful handheld tablet console. And they decided, let's make it so it can also work on a TV.
Yep.
And they basically did everything they wanted to do with the Wii U.
Yep.
But now it was possible. And we got the Switch. The hybrid console,
yeah,
as they call it.
The best console.
So the Switch was basically, it's a very powerful handheld that is attached to an upscaler that you can play on your TV.
Yeah.
That's basically, in layman's terms, what it is.
Yeah.
It's pretty powerful. It's more powerful than I want to say it's more powerful than a PS3. It's not quite as powerful as a PS4 or an Xbox One. I mean, let's be real.
But it's so awesome.
It had so many phenomenal games. And...
it still keeps getting them.
It is. It's still doing well. Like, Nintendo's not making a successor right now because it's still doing so good.
Yeah. They just made an updated version, the OLD.
Yeah, I mean, updated in the sense that it's got a slightly bigger screen and it has... the dock has a built-in Ethernet cable now.
Oh, okay.
But, so this generation is funny because Sony this generation isn't technically finished yet.
No.
Because Sony is still technically leading, but Nintendo is catching them.
Yeah.
There's honestly a good debate that Nintendo might win this generation in the long run.
Partially a lot of it having to do with just that, like, Nintendo is getting the consoles out there.
Well, that's next generation. We're still talking about Generation 8 here.
Oh.
There's a good point that retroactively Nintendo could win Generation 8.
Oh.
Just in terms of sales.
Yeah.
Because we move on from this, because honestly, PlayStation 4 was a great console.
Yeah.
And the Xbox One just fucking stumbled.
Yeah.
Like, so now we're going to get into the ninth generation where we currently are.
Yeah.
And it's still way too early to really call anyone a definitive leader right now.
Yeah.
Because Nintendo is still running off of their previous generation system with the Switch. And we get the two ninth gen systems, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series, whatever the fuck it's called. So right now, the biggest issue is, unfortunately, these systems came out in peak pandemic.
Yeah.
And the big problem right now is they just can't get them out.
Yeah.
Like, the reason why Sony is struggling right now is because they just can't get the PlayStation 5 out. Microsoft is getting Xbox Series X's out faster. The problem here, now this is also where we're getting into a new conundrum in gaming, is that I'm feeling physical versus digital.
Yeah.
Because I am a strict physical gamer. Like, I don't really care for digital gaming very much.
Yeah.
The problem is, though, it's very appealing to a lot, and Microsoft has found a stranglehold with Game Pass right now, which is a very appealing service if you're not like me and you don't care about physical games. Because it is very well done, and I admit, Microsoft found something here. Especially considering the fact that their console itself has nothing else to offer when you really look at it. There's no exclusives on it.
No.
The problem is, though, I have a PlayStation 5. I adore it.
Yeah.
But there's just nothing to play on it right now. You can only play so much Ratchet and Clank and Demon's Souls.
Yeah.
Because we're still in that period where a lot of games
Is it backwards compatible?
It is fully backwards compatible with PS4, which is nice.
Okay.
Because I've retired my PS4 at this point, and I'm just using my PS5 now. The problem is, no one has one. Like, people are fighting to get the things.
Yeah.
And they don't really have a good Game Pass alternative yet.
No.
And I mean, we're getting into like console bias again, and people prefer some things.
Yeah.
People can scream Sony's dying all they want. Sony's not dying.
Yeah.
Nintendo's not dying. Microsoft's not dying.
And
at this point right now, it's still way too early to count. And honestly, I would like to revisit this at some point in the next couple of years, if we're still doing this podcast by then.
Yeah.
And just see who comes out on top.
Yeah.
Because people are acting like Sony's made a huge mistake this generation. Let's be real here. In the Microsoft-Sony battle, who won Gen 7? I'm just gonna say that.
Yep.
Who else had a very slow start?
Yep.
Who else looked like they really fucked up at the beginning?
Yeah. No, it's true.
It's too early, guys. So, the console wars are always fascinating to me like that.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's fun to watch, especially when you're a neutral party like me who like just likes to play games and prefers to play retro games anyways.
Yep.
It's really fun to watch the fan bases bicker and like people act like be super dramatic over this stupid shit.
Yeah.
But yeah. So anyways, guys, once again, thanks for joining us. That was a fun discussion. I mean, I feel like I talked my butt off there the whole time.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that like it's more of a you said.
It's more you're sitting here going, I didn't know that. That's cool.
No, yeah. It's educational for me, I guess.
You were my moral support as I ranted for 20 minutes.
Yes.
Also, I'd like to do a shout out because it's very similar in topic, but I did a guest appearance on a podcast, the Gaming Memories podcast. We've appeared on it in the past, but I did a guest appearance on that talking about the history of gaming, like console generations, which was kind of my inspiration for this. We've only done 2 episodes. Only the first one at this point as of now is out.
Yep.
But I want to give a shout out to Cade and Chris from Retro Hangover because we had a great discussion over there.
Yeah.
And you guys should definitely check it out. But anyways, guys, once again, thanks for joining us on the Gaming and Collecting Podcast. The Gaming and Collecting Podcast can be found on all your major podcasting platforms, particularly Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We're made on Anchor Podcasts, and you can follow us on all your social media platforms, particularly Twitter, Instagram, Good Pods. And the episodes are at some point going to be out on YouTube. I've kind of put on hiatus for that right now until we get through the move.
Yep.
So actually, by the time this episode comes out, the move will be done, but that is besides the point. But anyways, guys, once again, thanks for joining us. We will see you all next time.
See you later.
All right, see ya.
Bye.